Welcome. Today, we are diving deep, and I mean deep, into maybe the most complex and fascinating object in the entire known universe, the human brain. We're going to go on a journey to find the tiny, tiny messengers that create every single thought, feeling, and memory you have ever had. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's start with a really big question. It seems simple today, but for centuries, this was a massive, massive debate. Where does the real you actually live? Where's the seat of your consciousness, your mind, your very self? Is it in your heart, the thing that pounds in your chest when you get excited or scared? Or is it in that 3-pound lump of tissue sitting inside your skull?
So let's get right into this historic showdown, the brain hypothesis versus the heart hypothesis.
On one side, you had thinkers like Empedocles who argued it was all about the heart. And, it kind of makes sense, right? You feel your emotions right there in your chest. But then you had physicians, guys like Hippocrates and Galen, who were firmly on team brain. And Galen, he had some pretty compelling proof. He was the guy treating injured gladiators, and he saw a direct, undeniable link. You damage a gladiator's brain, and you cause specific changes in their behavior and how they function. That was some of the first real clinical evidence, and it was an absolute game changer.
And listen, this wasn't some quick argument they settled over a weekend. We're talking about a debate that raged for over 2,000 years. Now, of course, we all accept the brain hypothesis today, but that old idea of the heart has definitely left its mark on our language. I mean, we still talk about having a broken heart or doing something heartfelt. Okay, so we've settled where the magic happens. It's in the brain. So now let's zoom way, way in and see how it happens. It is time to meet the absolute star of our show, the neuron.
So what is a neuron? Well, it is the fundamental building block of your entire nervous system. The best way to think of it is as the brain's own special messenger, a tiny cell that is dedicated to just one thing, processing and transmitting information. And when you get billions of these working together, well, that's what creates you. All right, let's take one apart, piece by piece. We'll start with the soma, which is just the cell body. This is basically the neuron's command center. It's got the nucleus and all the other machinery it needs to keep the cell alive and functioning. It's really the life support system for our little messenger. Now, sprouting out from that soma, you see all these little branch-like things? Those are the dendrites. You can think of them as the neuron's antennas. Their whole job is just to listen, to pick up all the incoming signals and messages that are being sent from thousands of other neurons all around them. So once the soma processes all those incoming signals, it sends out its own message. And it sends that message down the axon. This is a long, slender cable that acts like an information superhighway, carrying the signal away from the cell body, sometimes over surprisingly long distances. And way down at the very end of that axon, we find the terminal buttons. A great way to think of these is like the departure terminals at an airport. This is where the message finally arrives, all ready to be passed on to the dendrites, the antennas, of the very next neuron in the chain. So we know the parts, but how does the message actually travel down that axon superhighway? Well, the answer is a beautiful and unbelievably fast electrical event. Okay, let's walk through this because it is truly incredible. When a neuron is just resting, its inside is negatively charged. That's its waiting state. But when a strong enough signal comes in, bam! Little gates in its membrane fly open and positively charged sodium ions flood inside. This flip from negative to positive is the signal. It's called the action potential. It creates a wave of electricity that just zips down the axon like a row of falling dominoes. And then, just as fast, the neuron pumps all those ions back out and resets itself, all ready for the next signal. Now here's a crucial point about this signal. It's all or none. It's like firing a gun. The neuron either fires with its full, complete strength, or it doesn't fire at all. There is no such thing as a half signal. So you might be wondering, how does the brain signal intensity? The difference between a soft touch and a hard slap? It's not with a bigger spark, but by firing faster. More signals per second equals a stronger message. So, that electrical spark is fantastic for traveling within a single neuron. But what happens when it reaches the end of the line? How does it jump that tiny gap to get to the next neuron? Well, this is where it gets really clever. It switches from an electrical signal to a chemical one. That gap is called the synapse. It's an incredibly tiny, fluid-filled space between the terminal button of one neuron and the dendrite of the next. That electrical signal we were just talking about, it can't jump across this gap, so it needs a totally different strategy. And this right here brings us to maybe the most important shift in this whole entire process. Communication within a single neuron is electrical, but communication between neurons is chemical. This switch is absolutely fundamental to everything your brain does. So here's how that chemical handshake works. When the electrical action potential gets to the terminal button, it triggers the release of these special chemicals called neurotransmitters. These chemicals then just float across that tiny synapse and lock into receptors on the next neuron, kind of like a key fitting perfectly into a lock. And when they bind, that delivers the message, telling the next neuron whether it should fire its own signal or just stay quiet for a moment. Okay, so we've seen the neuron, we've seen the electrical spark, and we've seen the chemical handshake. Now let's zoom all the way back out and connect these tiny microscopic events to the biggest question of them all: consciousness. Just stop and think about this for a second. Every single thought you have, every sight you see, every emotion you feel, it is all the result of trillions upon trillions of these tiny electrical sparks and chemical handshakes happening every single second inside your brain. It is a staggering, mind-boggling thought. But how can we be so sure that consciousness actually comes from this physical process? Well, one of the best ways is to look at what happens when the machinery gets disrupted. In a strange condition called blind sight, damage to the visual cortex can make a person consciously blind. They'll swear they can't see anything. And yet, they can still accurately guess where an object is. Or look at split brain patients. When the connection between the two brain hemispheres is cut, information shown to one side of the brain isn't consciously known by the other, and yet the patient can still physically interact with what they claim not to know is there. These cases show us that our awareness is tied directly to these specific neural pathways. All of this leads to a pretty profound conclusion. Consciousness isn't some magical, mystical thing. It is a physiological process. It is an emergent property that's built from the ground up by the brain's complex electrochemical network, built from the simple, repetitive actions of all these individual neurons.
And this leaves us with a final and kind of awe-inspiring question to think about. If our entire universe of thought, our creativity, and all our emotions are built on these simple, predictable, almost mechanical sparks, what does that really say about us? What are the true limits of what your brain, can understand, create, and ultimately become?